Okay, Noel Pearson, Cape York Institute.
And Zoe Ellerman, Cape York Institute.
Thank you, Noel. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Commissioners, for this opportunity to present to this inquiry. We had the opportunity to make submissions to the ALRC's inquiry into the same subject, and we declined, mainly because I was never convinced that anything they would do would make any impression on the growing problem of Indigenous incarceration. My view after reading their previous publications was that it didn't confront the history of this issue going back to the Royal Commission, namely that we identified overrepresentation as a fundamental problem back in 1991, and nothing we have done in the 30 years since has turned that overrepresentation around. In fact, imprisonment has increased across the nation. And I thought that the ALRC's inquiry was not going to add anything new to the discussion of the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison. I've been a long critic of the so-called Ricky Dick, and at least for the past 20 years I've been saying, well, we had a massive inquiry, we had 330 plus recommendations, and yet the numbers are doubled of people in prison. And why aren't we confronting that fact? And how could it be that despite the fact that we have better procedures presumably and better grills over windows and so on, nevertheless we're not making a dent in the problem of overrepresentation. I then witnessed the Queensland Government's attempt to come to grips with this issue with the Justice Partnership Agreement in 2001. Probably the most serious attempt of any government around the country to try to come to grips with it, the Beattie government. And again, a 10-year partnership was announced, a set of strategies, a matrix of initiatives and presumably budget allocations under those initiatives and so on. And it was becoming apparent, well, in the midst of that 10-year partnership that numbers were going up.
Yep.
And of course the whole thing ended dismally with the fact that there was no improvement, numbers had gone up. The 10-year partnership. How can a government, how can any society and government set itself an explicit goal of halving the number of people in prison and halving the participation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, end up, despite this so-called conscious aspiration and effort, end up with an increased number of people in that prison system. And so setting a target is useless if we go by the Beattie government's experience in this state. It means nothing, it drives nothing, and yet we have one of the political parties contending for the federal election in this election saying that the big promise is that we will have a justice target. As if we don't have a history about targets. What that political party and all contending political parties should be telling us is, well, okay, so what are we going to do? What do we do to turn this thing around? And so I've read, I've perused the Queensland Government submission to this inquiry, and it's depressing. Depressing for the lack of anything compelling, anything that gives me any, even in my most optimistic moment, the belief that in 10 years' time we're going to see a turnaround in these numbers. And I'd put my I put a lot of money down on the table to bet that it's not going to turn around. We're approaching 50% of children in the child protection system being Indigenous. I don't know when we're going to cross that line. And I bet we are not going to fall shy of 50%. Nothing we are doing is going to mean that we don't reach 50%, and probably keep progressing beyond that. And the same miserable story is in the youth justice scene, youth detention scene, the existence of disabilities amongst remote communities. Professor Ernest Hunter really upset me when he once wrote quite a few years ago now, that our remote communities in particular had become concentrations of disability. Places where the compounding intergenerational disability is where we keep people in this state, in remote communities. Our work with the Cape York Aboriginal Australian Academy, when we got the Royal Flying Doctor Service to help us assess children in our 3 schools at the time, Arakoon, Cohen and Hopevale, showed us the first 25 student sample across those schools told us these levels of intellectual disability of children damaged by early trauma and acquired disabilities and loss of executive function were just appalling. I mean, 30% of the kids were at the very lowest level of intelligence, and another 40% were not far above the line. We're talking about 70% of the kids. And yet we could submit all of the details of the actions we took to try and get a response through the disabilities, through the special needs procedures of the State Education Department, to no avail. Absolutely no avail. And we tried for 2 years after that to try and get a response to the special needs of these kids. And we think that the causes of this overrepresentation, so-called, lie back in the rise of grog and drugs in the communities. A recent paper by Professor Hunter in Lancet tells us of the huge mental illness load in these Cape York communities, massive. And Professor Hunter's been out in the field diagnosing and administering psychotic therapies, drugs, to hundreds of people in the community. And that, I don't think there's, well, first thing we have to recognise is what he and the Lancet evidence tells us, and what Professor Sutton told us in The Politics of Suffering when he looked at the data for Arakoon back in, when he published his book in 2004 or something, 3, that 1985 is the key date, 1985. The forced imposition of canteens into the communities by the Queensland government. And then everything goes haywire after that. The elders didn't want it, the ladies didn't want it, even the drinkers themselves didn't want it. And Russ Hens, the then Minister for Local Government, wanted the communities to take on the canteens because that was a laundering mechanism for Commonwealth Social Security payments to fund the newly implemented system of local government. Russ's idea was that if Arakoon Shire Council was going to be funded, it had to be funded through the canteen, and the canteen itself would be funded from Social Security checks and by the Commonwealth. So the funding of local government in Aragon from 1985 was through the livers and kidneys and bodies of the people of Aragon. And that the growth of the problem over the following decades produced a generation of children born in violence and fetal alcohol syndrome and a range of these terrible problems. ABC did a Four Corners report by David Meyer in 1990 called Six Pack Politics, and that was 5 years into the problem. And we never got on top of that problem in any serious way until alcohol management plans were introduced in the 2000s. So this problem raged for a full 20 years without any serious amelioration or abatement. And by then, we had then developed a generation of people who were becoming parents. People who themselves had suffered in the womb and in early childhood were then becoming parents themselves. So the so-called cycle of this problem was now well underway. And thank goodness the PD government introduced, on our urging, by the way, on the Cape York Institute's urging, alcohol management plans. And there was a Lancet article back then that showed the immediate reduction of the severity of violence. Not so much the incidence of violence, but its severity was very much curtailed by alcohol management plans. I think the bigger breakthrough was made by Premier Bligh when she took the canteens away from the councils. So that was a further step. And most important thing was to break the council's control over and reliance upon the canteens. I mean, we were in a ridiculous situation where the councils themselves were relying on money from the canteen to address the problems arising from the existence of the canteen. So Bligh's action to take the canteens away produced a more decisive improvement in the figures, and but that only lasted until 2012. And if you look at the statistics produced by the department at the time, show very clearly that when contending for the 2012 election, Campbell Newman said everyone should have a right to have a beer on the porch. From that moment on, the problems spikes. A problem that had been steadily declining during the 10 years previous under Labor spikes into a major problem, very clear in the statistics, after the state kind of licensed the view that Aboriginal people should be entitled to have a drink. And policy has been all over the place in relation to alcohol management ever since. Half-hearted implementation, a department that you don't know whether they want to get rid of the alcohol management plans, and councils that receive a very clear message that, your community's performance in terms of reducing harm, alcohol-related and other harm, is not part of the expectation that the state has of these councils. Mainstreaming the councils has meant that the government doesn't want to treat these councils any differently from any other local government and hold them to account for harm levels amongst their people. So I think the model of local government doesn't work in these communities, and these are sui generis governments. They're specific to the circumstances of Indigenous communities. They don't have a rate base. They don't have freehold land ownership. They don't have people who own their own homes and so on. You can't treat them as if they're a little country town and a standard form local government. We will have elections next March. The incentives for the councillors in those local governments will be, will be to do those things that their community members, a lot of them might want. And the usual tactic is to be in favour of access to alcohol. So Orocoon Shire Council's minutes recently disclosed that they propose a alcohol trial. And I received an email just in the last 24 hours saying they propose a trial. State of origin night. Probably the most violent night in the state is when they propose to reintroduce alcohol in the name of fun and recreation. So, whereas I think that the councils and the community should be held to performance, they should be responsible for. They should be funded on the basis of their performance in reducing harm. School attendance, hospital presentations, magistrate court appearances, breaches of alcohol management plans. Communities should receive a base funding from the state, but any kind of incentive, there should be a massive system of incentive payments for those organisations if they help make progress in relation to reducing harm. We proposed this kind of framework about 12 years ago or something, when Minister Pitt was the minister, the older Pitt, Pitt the elder. We proposed a system, a cascading system, that if you improve, your funding increases. If you bring the levels of harm down to the Queensland average, there should be incentive payments for the councils and organisations so that they could invest it in those things that they believed could develop their community. Anyway, a kind of a very small incentive program was introduced. Nothing that would change the dial on their behaviour. When you're a council receiving $45 million from the state and Commonwealth, having a couple of $100,000 incentive payment is not going to change your behaviour. And, do the things that might reduce harm for your children and women and community members. So, I don't usually participate in exercises like this because I think this is very criminology, and incarceration is such a depressing and useless scene. Very rarely do I see anything that's compelling, gives me any hope that change will happen. I'm here because QPC's first report on Indigenous empowerment and disadvantage and service delivery is probably the most compelling Indigenous affairs policy in the country that we've ever seen. The state has broken through, this commission has broken through on important policy recommendations with that first report. And if this inquiry adds to that, on this specific topic of imprisonment and recidivism, then I think it's worth putting the energy into encouraging you to build on that first report. I think empowerment is ultimately, as the Royal Commission originally said, it was the only thing that really was the most worthwhile thing in the original Royal Commission in '91, the notion that at the end of the day, Indigenous communities, families, individuals need to be empowered and take charge of our own destiny. But we never did anything about it, and the Royal Commission never articulated the how. The why and the what was answered, but how do you do it? I think the QPC report goes a long way towards answering the how. But of course the complaint we make in our submission is about how absolutely inadequate the Queensland Government's response to the QPC's report is. It's terrible. 10-page response, for goodness sake, after 12 months. They're not serious. We're not even. Cape York Institute, having been perhaps jaundiced and maybe lots of people disagree with our points of view and so on, but nevertheless, you cannot say that we haven't been involved in the policy debate on these issues. We're not even invited into the Queensland Government's response to the QPC report. And all because they know that we're at odds with the kind of response they propose. So I think you've got to grapple with the response by the Queensland Government to the QPC report. I think they don't get the fact that this is not about service delivery alone. When Jesus was in the desert being tempted, he said, man cannot live by service delivery alone. And there's another part of it. Yeah, we need good services. It's our entitlement to have delivered to us good services. But a lot of the issues that we're trying to address here cannot be the subject of service delivery. They're about what everybody else does in pursuit of better lives for themselves and so on. Jobs and enterprise and things that they can achieve themselves without a middle-class service deliverer with a program and a fax machine or whatever they have nowadays. And the Queensland Government's stuck in that old paradigm, all right, problem, we need a program and we need a bunch of bureaucrats to deliver it or an NGO to deliver it. They just cannot break that mould. We need innovation. That's about right. It's not going to be a program. It's going to be about, I'd rather give the grant program to the families as an incentive payment or a subsidy or something direct into the households, instead of thinking in the social, the dominant social policy paradigm of Queensland and Australia that's turned our community into a almost lifeless cadaver for the service delivery system to use as clients. We don't talk about welfare reform. We don't even use the words passive welfare in any policy document of the Queensland Government. I think passive welfare is real. It exists. It's a real phenomenon of black fellas, white fellas, Asian fellas, immigrants, any community that's long-term dependent upon welfare that has become intergenerational, exhibit a whole range of social problems, where even the provision of opportunity doesn't turn around things. So we're going to come to grips with passive welfare. And we're going to have policies in response to empower people to break out of that cycle and to stop accepting it as a permanent destination, because blackfellas should have a right beyond that. So there's a lot of things that we hope we can address in a supplementary submission to the Commission. I particularly after reading other submissions to the inquiry, the Queensland Government's one in particular, as I say, there's no policy emanating from the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy that's worth anything. You've asked me not to defame them, but I hope they might not pursue me in relation to that. But, the department's supposed to be a policy department, but they could not generate any coherent policy. They have no capacity. They never have had capacity in the past and so on. There's no thinking emerging from that department that would that comes anywhere near the QPC's report last year. And I don't know that will ever be remedied. So I'll leave it there. I think there's a real, I remain hopeful that perhaps if you produce the standard, criminological report about incarceration, at least as far as it concerns our people, my son will be appearing before another commission in 10 or 20 years' time saying, "My father told you so." That there'd be no change in the dial. Whereas if you could hit the problem from another angle that your previous report did, I think we stand a chance of getting on top of this thing. We're not a criminal people. We are not criminals. And yet, how come we're 27% of the jail population in this state? Aboriginal people love their children like anybody else does, but how come 50% of them are in child protection? There's a structural problem here, and we're going to tackle the structural problem. This state has got to come to grips with the fact that we produce too many matrices, service delivery matrices. The fairy tales told in the Queensland Government's submission about what they're doing. Okay. Maybe the Commission really need to examine all of the assertions about programs and initiatives that the state is aware of in this area that are supposedly having an effect and really interrogate. Okay. So you had a workshop to establish a youth council in Cherbourg, but what are you enabling the community to do? What is the rubber hitting the road on the ground? My final comment, I've given you some results on the Cape York Aboriginal Australian Academy, and they show comparison between the Academy's results and other Cape York schools. The tragic one is Ellerman. The state, it's 2 years now since they took the school away from the Academy, and this is the attendance results at Ellerman. Prior, while the Academy was in, and then after the Academy has left. Prior to 2010, 2010 to 2016, and then these past 2 years. Why would the state destroy progress like that to return a school to the miserable situation it was in 10 years prior? So those, the future, you want to know where the driving origins of this problem are, it is in actions like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Zoe, do you have any comments to make?
Just pick up a couple of points. So this one feels a bit like stating the obvious, but given it doesn't appear to be obvious to our political masters, I'll state it anyway. But in terms of kind of setting a justice target and the issues with that, the current problem with the current closing the gap targets, very clearly there is nothing that connects the target to action on the ground in a particular place. So the architecture doesn't connect the target at all with things that might improve outcomes, which is obviously an issue well known to the QPC, and hence in your last report you did propose a new architecture. It's also what the Empowering Communities report tried to set out. How do we put in place a new architecture that actually gives people on the ground decision-making power about funding, about programs, about shifting investment from one area to another for their community so they can try different things, learn over the long term, rather than having every government come in, change of personnel, change of people, change of approach, and still just complete disconnect between where we want to get to and how funding hits the ground. The other thing I just want to emphasise is that over the long term, I think we're seeing even greater risk aversion to giving Indigenous people real power. At the moment in Queensland, the only example I can think of is the Families Responsibilities Commission, where local people have power that would otherwise be in the hands of state government departments to decide how to respond to individuals and families when there's a need for intervention. And even that appears to be at risk at the moment, with its future uncertain. But we no longer have community police with any real power, so there has been, I think, erosion of those even initial ideas that we had some decades ago. The same, I think, could be said for community justice groups. They certainly haven't fulfilled their potential in terms of what they might be able to do in terms of conflict resolution or mediation on the ground. Their role has been progressively narrowed to just a court support, just a criminal justice support role. And again, unless we've got people on the ground who actually feel they have some skin in the game and can do something about the issues in their own community, then we're not going to make headway into these issues.
Zoe, thank you. Noel, thank you again.
Thank you.
Commissioner Fredericks, a question?
You've raised a number, thank you for those presentations, and acknowledge all of that experience, skills and knowledge that you have working on the ground with communities in Cape York. I'm wondering, in terms of some of the ideas you put forward and also what's in the initial submission, if some of that has the capacity to also translate, particularly like that incentive scheme you just spoke about, Noel, to other communities, Indigenous and perhaps non-Indigenous communities in this state.
Yes, I think we used to have quarterly reports published by the department that showed progress. I think it was the best system in the country. It was developed by the Bligh government, BD and then Bligh. And so every quarter you could see how those communities were progressing with school attendance, hospital admissions and magistrate court appearances and so on. So 5 or 6 measures that... and our view was that, finally we had a metric that was public, and we proposed that, that performance should then be linked with the state's state incentive program, and I think it could be universal. That bringing down harm should be the first responsibility of these governing bodies. The mayor and her councillors should be kind of waiting for the next quarterly report, like a treasurer waits for the whatever, interest rates, whatever. Their future should hang off their performance in relation to bringing harm down. And the incentive payment should be really generous, should be flexible, should enable them to spend on community and economic development initiatives that they believe are needed for the community, and really get the mindset away from just managing the harm in the community and exacerbating it, in my view, in a lot of ways, to one of actually our fate as a council is dependent on us bringing those numbers down, and so I think that could be a universal mechanism. So local governments, you don't have entire control over all of the levers, but I believe local governments and councils have particularly Indigenous communities, they have a very, just their authority, right? Their attitude, their leadership has a lot of bearing on whether we can bring those harm levels down. So yes, and when we proposed the kernel of the idea to the department, actually, they produced a very impressive, it was the one thing I've ever seen them do that was any use, but they produced a very impressive response, how this could be implemented. But Minister Pitt at the time didn't want to run with it, so it was shelved. But I think that enjoining the leadership of the community through the councils into a harm reduction drive, and that is a key function of your responsibility as organisations and leaders, is something that I urge the Commission to look at.
Well, I sit here with a sort of a sense of shame that 1985 decision of forced imposition of canteens and that washing of welfare funds through the livers and kidneys of the residents, as you described it, in a very confronting way. Could you unpack a little for me? How could alcohol be better managed? What's a process you think may be better than what we're seeing today in the communities that you're involved with?
Well, I think it's, the levels of entrenchment of addiction and are high. The statistics tell us that. So it's like if people have an alcohol problem, an addictive problem, then trying to manage responsible drinking, which is what we tried to do for decades, doesn't work. It's like if your own family member had a problem with grog and you were trying to encourage responsible drinking, it doesn't work. And so when we introduced alcohol management restrictions, it meant that responsible drinkers were caught by that. But it was kind of, we're trying to help the rest of the community that we know has a problem. So, a person at Hopevale, if they want to go and have a drink, go to the pub or the cafe or the restaurant in Cooktown and have a drink, or when you're in Cairns and so on. But let's try to make Hopevale a place where we know the problem is very big, a place where we all agree that there's no alcohol.
Yeah.
I think there's a cultural element to it as well. My own perhaps controversial view is that our kinship is a big risk factor with drinking. I've got lots of relatives, and they can put the head on me for anything.
Yeah.
And that's but it is the greatest feature of our culture, our kinship. But you add grog to that, and it goes really bad. So I think that that you can't just treat our communities as mainstream towns. We've got a very dense kinship culture that we have to take account of here, and which is why lots of other cultures don't have alcohol. Lots of Orthodox cultures don't have alcohol. If you did, you wouldn't have an Orthodox culture. And so I would say that one of the problems with alcohol management plans is that at the stages of introducing it, the moral ownership of those plans should have been vested in the community, in the women, in the justice groups, in those who wanted to say yes. The women at Wudjal at the time, the women on the justice group, the elders, they wanted to stand next to the police. They proposed to accompany the state police in checking the cars at the gate of the village. And their idea was we want to send a message to our community members that we support the restriction of alcohol there. Oh no, operationally we can't do that. Too dangerous, blah, blah, blah. So the moral ownership of these restrictions is not very strong. And it is because we didn't go about it. We didn't plan the AMPs in a way that gave the community ownership of them. Because you can't tell me that there weren't lots of people, particularly women, particularly justice group members, who wanted to take control of the alcohol problem. There always were people who wanted to do that. And so, I think policy in relation to alcohol management plans has been in such a state of, we don't even know where the state stands in relation to it. Should we relax them? Should we get rid of them? Should we change them? Should we give the councils back their power over those things and so on? It's not really clear what the state's position is on alcohol management anymore, whereas under Beattie and Bligh it was very clear.
You couldn't even say at the moment that there is a clear policy position that the harm levels, we know that, alcohol misuse is connected to high levels of offending. We know the impact that it has on child development. And yet, from a policy perspective, you couldn't even say that there is a clear message that the levels of alcohol-related harm in communities must get down to a normal level. Not even that is clear.
Commissioner, I just want to say, in our submission, in our diagram here, is our attempt, for those who kind of push back on our focus on alcohol and other immediate drivers of the problem, our position is not that. Obviously our dispossession, our history, the discrimination we experience, the disempowerment, those are the ultimate, the original drivers of our problem. Is structural and historical. Cape York Institute believes that. But at the same time, we've got to focus on the proximate drivers, alcohol, and the high rates of offending that alcohol gives rise to, And I think my criticism of many attempts to come to grips with this problem is we shy away from those proximate drivers. We shy away from the fact that, okay, we've got to deal with high rates of offending. High rates of offending by a non-criminal people. That's what's happening. High rates of offending by non-criminal people. Why is that happening? And so we've got to address disempowerment. We've got to address discrimination. We've got to empower people to have more control over their lives. And so it's not a perfect illustration of our argument, but it is an attempt to make clear that acknowledge the ultimate drivers, but focus on the proximate drivers as well. And I think that was the original fault of the Royal Commission, quite frankly. Marcia Langton and Pat Dodson, the Indigenous unit at the time of the Royal Commission, really, they were clear about the role of grog. But the ultimate report kind of be non-offensive by saying that the progressive legal fraternity that drove the Royal Commission's report didn't want to get into the controversies about that. And therefore we never really focused on grog. If you look at the recommendations of the Royal Commission, there's not a full-on confrontation with the problems of grog. And of course in the remote communities, the situation with grog was and is very predatory, Yeah.
Now, can I bring you to an end there? We're out of time.
Thank you.
We have no time for comments from the floor as a result of this presentation. You finished in just the right place, I think, for this inquiry. Zoe and Noel, thank you very much for your presentation. Powerful, depressing, but I walked away with some optimism. There's clearly a way forward.
I think so.
I think we have here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and look forward very much to your supplementary submission, which will be forthcoming. Just a reminder to people in the audience today that the sessions are videotaped, so if you want to, when it is uploaded, be able to see the full presentation again of Noel and Zoe's presentation, but all presentations today, along with the transcripts.